Hey guys, Andrew here with Compete Elite, and today we are picking up with part 2 of our context series, and we're really delving into why sometimes coaches will say the dreaded "it depends." I remember this shit used to piss me off whenever coaches would say that to me, and I never really understood that there was a lot of context that surrounded a certain problem that should have dictated or could have completely changed their answer, right? And so if we just quickly review something that we kind of discussed last week in terms of what the contextual framework is around various topics. First of all, you have your assessment or your observation. Um, Delving into that, you have from there identifying the problem in the situation, how people perceive that, which then leads to the solution, the implementation, or the real objective, right? You can kind of see that there's other little small factors interrelated and interspersed in there that we'll kind of discuss as we go on through the series, right? So I want to shift your attention over here real quick and talk about some of this problem and solution. Again, some of the indicative factors of why it depends, right? And what we see is that there's a lot of different facets of fitness and health. Um, and the ones we're really going to focus on today are those that are related to the movement nature of program design and assessment, right? And so what we kind of have here, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, understand, and the first thing physics really dictates in terms of how we move. It's really difficult to deny those. Gravity, where you drop a ball, it's naturally going to hit the floor, right? Um, but your body kind of obeys the same laws of physics, and how your body interacts with the objects, so-called, is the biomechanical effect of whatever's going on, right? So whenever you think about moving, you're either effective or ineffective, and you're efficient or inefficient. And it's kind of a continuum and a little bit of a spectrum, right? Well, when you think about being effective and being efficient, a coach may say, when you ask them, hey, did my clean look good? Well, it depends. So, based off of how you're built, you might have a longer arm bone or a longer upper leg bone or anything like that, that can really dictate your ability to get the bar over your head in a snatch. Well, what's effective and allows you to get a task completed may not be ideal for repeated sustainable contractions, right? So if you ever think about your car breaks down and you want to push your car to the gas station or even just off the side of the road, typically what happens is you'll walk up to the car, you'll take a big deep breath, and then you'll start pushing the car. Very rarely are people breathing big, deep, controlled breaths as they're pushing a heavy object. Why? Because inherently we're seeking stability in order to complete the task. Now, I'm sure that if we could probably agree that either on a flat or an uphill surface, you're not going to push that car further than, probably 50 feet because it's not sustainable. So now we have a conversation that we have to understand in terms of, well, is what we're doing being effective? Are we able to complete the task, yes or no? Perfect. And then if we can, are we being as efficient or economically using our effort in the most energy saving kind of way, right? If you're doing a 1 rep max bench press is going to be very different in terms of sustainability than 50 reps of your body weight, right? So you can kind of consider some of the physiology that also surrounds this in terms of your body can only produce so much energy to support activity to a certain point before certain energy systems take over, and that's we'll talk about a little bit about the physiology and the energy production side as we go here. But again, just bringing it back for a second, movement capacity, which is basically your ability to complete movement, kind of ranges on that spectrum of efficient, inefficient, effective, and ineffective. And then from there, really identifying, and this is where when you ask your coach, hey, what can I do to make my snatch better? And they're like, well, it depends. Well, it depends on a lot of it surrounds your limitations, right? So if you consider this, Someone's limitation that is missing an arm to complete a 1 rep max snatch is going to be very different from someone that is, missing a leg. Someone else that is missing, um, you know, their hip, right? And so if we consider that and we take that very extreme example and we kind of generalize it to, if you have something going on with your hip that limits the function of it, that's going to dictate the path to improvement a little differently than if had a shoulder tweak and you still wanted to increase or maintain your strength capacity in that way. And so basically what we want to do in terms of identifying how it depends is your person hurt? Have you had a chronic shoulder injury that's lasted, the last damn 10 years, which maybe it could have to do with your acromion hook, or maybe your shoulder joint's just structured a little differently, right? So once we identify the history, well, now certain things may start to make sense. Oh, well, I broke my ankle once in 5th grade. Well, did you ever go see a physical therapist that was able to correct your movement abnormalities and kind of like fix that injury? Yes or no? If no, well, then it's not really a surprise. And then once we have an idea of what the history is, we want to start developing an understanding as the coach around that. And a lot of people experience, we can kind of break down stuff in several different kinds of limitations or dysfunctions as it relates to movement. The first being joint mobility dysfunction. And these are some terms that Gray Cook has identified in his literature, so you should go read his book, Movement, by the way. Great read. But joint mobility dysfunction really kind of, in lay terms, deals with how your joints are structured, right? So my elbow is built a very certain way that doesn't allow it to move past this far as I straighten it or extend it, right? Well, the same thing can happen in your hips. If you want to squat ass to grass, your hips may be structured a certain way that in order to complete that task, you're going to have to put yourself in slightly more compromising positions. And whenever we say compromising, really what we're indicating is that it's not ideal in terms of muscle recruitment patterns, and really allowing you to sustain that activity. Can you complete a 1 rep max snatch, sit your ass to the grass? Yes. Generally. But if your back is moving a lot, particularly in your lumbosacral, lumbopelvic region, what you'll find is that maybe it's not that sustainable as you're smashing on your joints and stuff all the time. So again, bringing it back to context, should I snatch? Can I squat all the way down? Well, it really depends. Are you built that way, or have you had something happen to you along the lines of your history that now precludes you from squatting that low? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends, right? So then if through some assessment features that we usually do, if we identify that, okay, sure, passively we can put you in a position and it doesn't change anything in terms of like if I push your leg up as I'm assessing passive hip range of motion and I see that your pelvis is following along with the leg, well, I know that there's probably bony restrictions, right? But if I'm able to take your knee and put it on your chest and your hip joint doesn't really move, or your pelvis doesn't really shift with that, then, well, something else is going on, right? So then we want to kind of consider maybe it might be a tissue extensibility dysfunction. Again, another Gray Cook term. And really what we're seeing is that there's a whole host of things that can surround tissue extensibility. It could be from as obscure as your gut health and your central nervous system, receiving some inputs that you're just under too much stress. Thanks, Mike Van. And that you just can't facilitate the extra stress of moving that way right now, right? This also incorporates and encompasses things such as like trigger point therapy, self-myofascial release. For example, if you have some pelvic instability, right? Or you find that you can't quite pull yourself down to the bottom of the squat. Maybe taking a foam roller and smoothing out, so to speak, or kind of releasing some of those trigger points in your inner thighs. Kind of counterintuitive, but maybe that might allow your pelvis to then sit a little better in the bottom of your squat and gain you a couple centimeters or inches in terms of end range of motion, right? So basically what we're saying is that Joint mobility dysfunction is something that you can't really correct because it's structural in nature. I mean, sure, there's research that we're not going to get down that rabbit hole. But then you have your tissue extensibility dysfunction where it's not necessarily something that you can't fix, right? Maybe through some manual release techniques from a physical therapist or a reputable chiro, or even just taking a foam roller and kind of rolling out your quads to help loosen up your hips in a way. Stretches, anything along those lines where you can elicit a change and kind of get a little more range, that would kind of qualify as the tissue extensibility dysfunction. Now, if we want to look at the last way that we can kind of identify limitations are, okay, so if someone, and I'm sure we've all seen that person that squats really wonky, where as they squat, if this is their pelvis, this is their spine, this is their pelvis, as they squat, they tend to hit this little bit of a butt wink, so to speak, right? This moment of flexion, and then as they stand up, their hips kind of readjust, and they're able to stand up out of that squat. Well, maybe it's a motor control issue, and they don't have the anterior core control, or basically, they don't have the motor control to move through that range or in that particular movement in a safe way as it's self-organized, right? So you might find that your coach will then kind of, they may do some reactive neuromuscular training techniques that can kind of trick your brain in one of these ways, where when we look at motor control, let's say that we're testing for squat mobility, right? I'm actively able to, or the patient or the athlete is passively able to get an end range of motion through my manipulation, not my manipulation, sorry, scope of practice, my trying to put their knee up closer to their chest, right? And then from there, so we've identified that no pelvic shift happens. Well, we look at tissue extensibility dysfunction, something like the Thomas test, where your client rolls on their back, holds their knees, drops one leg off, and you can kind of assess for quad shortness or shortness in the iliopsoas, in the hip flexor region. Well, now we've identified that nope, their leg falls straight down, everything's flat, hunky dory, right? But then for some reason, when we get them to stand up, we have trouble getting them to squat in a way that looks like it would fit their physiology, right? And so, I mean, for the most part, we all know if something looks weird, it probably is fucking weird. And so, backing up for a second, that's kind of one of the first things that you can use as an assessment tool, is just watching how the person moves in general. Do they constantly sit hunched over? Do they sit up tall? Are they able to articulate through the hips? When they sit down, do they overextend? Things like that. But basically, again, injury history, kind of pulling it back in, joint mobility dysfunction, are their bones able to move in a certain way? Do their joints allow this movement to occur? Tissue extensibility dysfunction, is the tissues itself not restricting the movement? And then motor control in terms of sensory info, proprioception, synergistic recruitment, and sensory motor integration. And all those things have very, very deep rabbit holes that you can go down. But basically, sensory information is how your body is perceiving the information around you, such as the texture of the ground, any smells, how cold it is, stuff like that, right? Proprioception is how your body is understanding its movement through space. Synergistic recruitment is basically how your body organizes to complete movements, right? So if you're doing a pull-up, you don't necessarily recruit just your lats. You don't necessarily just try to focus on using your biceps. Those things are more or less self-organized, right? And so your body is going to take your muscles, turn them on in a way that it thinks it can best achieve the task, right? Going back to completion versus sustainability. Now, sometimes we'll find out that maybe something isn't quite as sustainable if it's executed in a certain order. For example, if you're picking something up off the ground and you have that neutral spinal position, we can all agree that, most of us can agree that that's probably a very sustainable way to accomplish that activity. Whereas in sometimes when we see someone that does something a little out of sequence, in this case, we see that rounded upper back, that's not necessarily as sustainable, but it does allow for task completion. So basically what we're seeing is that if people have trouble using their hips, a lot of times their recruitment patterns will be more hamstring recruitment as well as erector or low back recruitment, right? And then sensory motor integration is just taking all that stuff and tying it in together. Basically, how realistically, no lift is ever the same because sensory information is always going to change. For example, if I'm doing double unders and my hair's hitting my face, um, that's going to differ each time I do a double under. My interactions with the ground as I'm going through that bit of plantar dorsiflexion and that stretch shortening cycle is also going to change a little bit. And then if you take a soccer player, for example, you put them in a cold, wet field, they're going to have a little bit different input and thus proprioception, and then sensory motor integration than a player that gets to play in the Caribbean on the beach somewhere, right? So, again, this is a very, very long video, like actually probably 60 minutes longer than I thought, just on some of the context and why your coach may say it depends. Now, hopefully, you're getting an idea that this is why people don't have this conversation with you right off the bat. When you ask, hey, what can I do to make my snatch better? Well, I'm like, hey, motherfucker, which one of these do we want to talk about today? And so a lot of times what I'll resort to is progressions and regressions in terms of this stuff of can I put them in a good position? And by good is relative for everyone. But when I say good, I'm referring to can I put them in a sustainable position that allows them to be successful, and that's kind of a psychological thing, in terms of completing the task and feeling empowered around that, right? So, anyhow, yep. Andrew here, Compete Elite. Follow us on YouTube and check us out on Instagram and Facebook. And, yep, shoot us any more questions that you may have, and we'll see you next time.